basically everyone in crypto, certainly all of your audience is going to be familiar with WBTC, or this idea of like a wrapped Bitcoin token. So some tokenized representation of Bitcoin that ultimately lives only on the Bitcoin blockchain. Arguably, from our perspective, the problem with WBTC is that is custodied by, well, until recently, one custodian. I don't think that's going to be how people use Bitcoin and DeFi 10 years from now. I think we're going to need a much more robust, much more permissionless, much more decentralized and censorship-resistant way to deploy Bitcoin into DeFi. And that's what tBTC is.
How you doing, everybody? Welcome to the lounge. My name's Burt Rock. This is the podcast where I sit back and chat with some of the builders creating apps and infrastructure in decentralized finance. Now, today's conversation is with MacLane Wilkison of Threshold Network. I really had a great time with this conversation. MacLane and I talk about the first on-chain merger, which was the process that actually created Threshold. We talk about unlocking Bitcoin liquidity in DeFi on Ethereum, on Solana, and other chains. And we talk about the importance of decentralization maximalism, which is something that I feel is really important and isn't talked about enough these days in the space. So before we get into this conversation, I want to let you know that this podcast is brought to you by Quenta. Quenta is an on-chain perps marketplace where you can trade dozens of markets on 3 chains using up to 50x leverage. You can use portfolio margin, you can use multiple collateral types. It's one of the greatest on-chain trading experiences available today, and you should check it out at quenta.io. That's Kwenta.io. Now, why don't you sit back, relax, and we'll dive in. Introduce yourself a little bit and your role at Threshold, and then we'll talk a little bit about what Threshold is and what tBTC is.
Sure. So my name is MacLane Wilkison. I am a contributor to Threshold Network. Threshold itself is actually the combination of 2 previous networks, NuCypher and Keep, which did the first on-chain merger, DAO to DAO, a couple years ago. I'm one of the original founders of NuCypher, so coming from that side of the community. Started that project back in, I guess it was 2016. And NuCypher, now Threshold, basically started as a infrastructure project building on Threshold Cryptography. And Threshold is sort of the current instantiation of that. So basically Threshold has a bunch of nodes that people stake the native token T in order to run those nodes and then provide various Threshold cryptography services. So the most popular one that many of your audience might already know is tBTC, which is a decentralized and permissionless Bitcoin bridge.
Interesting. So Keep and NuCypher were the first merger, you said. What was Keep at the time? You said you're originally from NuCypher, right?
Yeah. So Keep was also like, of all like the many different projects in crypto, I think like Keep was like the most similar one from a sort of technical and architecture perspective. It was also a Threshold cryptography network. At the time, NuCypher was more focused on decryption and access control. So using Threshold cryptography basically to gate access to content. And Keep was focused on Threshold signatures, and specifically for the version 1 of tBTC, which ran on Keep, using Threshold signatures and distributed key generation to basically build a decentralized Bitcoin bridge. And so like, I think like looking forward, I think both of our communities saw, even though we're building in slightly different places at once, many of the same use cases and applications made a lot of sense to build on top of one network or the other. And so like the motivation to combine the 2 networks into one was like, hey, we can just combine the 2 communities, we can combine all these use cases, run everything on one stronger, larger network, as opposed to running sort of like in weaker versions of all the same applications on both networks simultaneously and just competing with each other.
Interesting. So is Threshold BTC then? I know that's kind of what we're most familiar with because Quenta is looking to support Threshold BTC. Is that kind of the main focus of the project right now?
That's the primary application right now. There's also a conditional access control application called Taco, which is much earlier, but like it's getting pretty good traction in terms of people using it for like conditional access control. So wanting to grant access to some piece of content, whether it's like an encrypted video stream, blog post, something, based off of some on-chain condition. So like ownership of an NFT or
Oh,
like confirmation of some payment to a particular address, for example.
that's pretty cool. So we could gate this conversation even using that
Yep.
technology, right?
So you could gate
All
this
right.
conversation subject like, I don't know, people owning a particular token or people making a payment to you to get access to the conversation. Basically any sort of arbitrary condition that can be expressed on chain.
That's really interesting. I'm gonna ask you a couple more questions about that later, but right now I kind of want to know a little bit more about tBTC. Like I know like the concept is it's Bitcoin that's on chains other than Bitcoin. So what
Hmm.
what made you guys think that this was kind of a great use case, maybe for Bitcoin holders specifically? What made you think of this application?
Sure. So I mean, I think basically everyone in crypto, certainly all of your audience, is going to be familiar with WBTC or this idea of like a wrapped Bitcoin token. So like some tokenized representation of Bitcoin that ultimately lives only on the Bitcoin blockchain. But then there's an IOU token or some sort of receipt that's issued on Ethereum or some other chain that represents like a claim on that token. So WBTC is obviously like the the leader at the moment, like roughly 9 or 10 billion TVL. People use it all across DeFi to LP, as collateral to lend and borrow to do basically anything that you can imagine across DeFi. The sort of arguably from our perspective, the problem with WBTC is that is custodied by well, until recently, one custodian, which was BitGo. More recently, they've expanded that to a second custodian as well, BitGo. But it's fundamentally like a centralized custody model where you have to trust this custodian to hold on to your Bitcoin, to properly secure it, to basically make sure that that collateral is held securely. Uh, and that's just obviously like from our perspective, like that's sort of like a kludge. That's like, I don't think that's going to be how people use Bitcoin and DeFi, 10 years from now. I think we're going to need a much more robust, much more permissionless, much more decentralized and censorship resistant way to deploy Bitcoin into DeFi. And that's what tBTC is. So that's what we built at Threshold. And tBTC, instead of this single central custodian or second two custodians, uses a network of nodes that are leveraging threshold cryptography, so specifically distributed key generation and threshold signatures, to collectively secure the Bitcoin and custody the Bitcoin. So instead of one or two custodians, you split the custody across dozens, hundreds, potentially thousands of custodians that are all sort of
Okay.
economically incentivized to provide this service.
So it's like a similar idea, but you've like decentralized the concept of a custodian,
Yeah, I
right?
mean the use
It's
case is identical. You have Bitcoin on the Bitcoin blockchain. You can't really do anything with it. You want to deploy that in DeFi on Ethereum or another smart contract blockchain. So you have a choice to either send it to a centralized custodian and fully trust them, or you can use a decentralized model where you're splitting the trust across many independent entities and actors to do that instead.
Now, I think that's really cool because I've always wondered, one of the most important kind of assets in DeFi is USDC, and USDC is fully centralized. So I've always kind of wondered what the purpose is of building these decentralized tools, building all this on-chain infrastructure, and then just running it through something completely centralized,
Yeah,
right? So I guess that's kind of the same problem you guys are solving here.
yeah, I mean, very similar. There's a lot of more decentralized stablecoins that are taking like various approaches, like CDPs, over collateralized stablecoins, that are much more trust minimized, or in some cases fully trustless, as compared to USDC. And that's basically what tBTC is doing for the Bitcoin synthetic or derivative space.
Now, what exactly is threshold cryptography? I mean, how is the BTC being secured here?
Yeah, so basically, maybe we can compare side by side with the wrapped Bitcoin. So when you have Bitcoin, and let's say you want to use WBTC, you send your Bitcoin to BitGo, and then they mint on the Ethereum side an IOU token that represents that deposit. So you send them one Bitcoin, they issue you one WBTC. Same exact situation happens with tBTC, except instead of sending your Bitcoin to an address that's controlled by BitGo, what happens is all the nodes in the threshold network basically collectively come together to generate an address on the Bitcoin side where you would deposit the Bitcoin. And the way that they do this is using something called distributed key generation. So basically, they do this process where they communicate with each other and generate an address, a Bitcoin address. Looks like any other Bitcoin address, but no one has the private key to that address. That private key is instead sort of collectively split across all of the participating nodes. And you send your Bitcoin to that deposit address. Threshold network issues you an IOU token, tBTC, on the Ethereum side representing that deposit. And then you can use that tBTC token on Ethereum, to lend and borrow to LP, to move it to another, an L2 or some other chain to do similar things there. And the difference, so we have one difference is, collectively custodying the Bitcoin across many nodes. And then the other difference is when you want to go back from Ethereum or some other chain to Bitcoin. So with wrapped Bitcoin, you burn your WBTC and you basically say, hey, BitGo, I burned my
Trust them to
WBTC.
send it to you,
Please
right?
give me my Bitcoin back. And then on the tBTC side, very similar, except you basically have to get you have to basically prove to a sufficient number of nodes that are custodying the address, sort of threshold of nodes or some quorum. So like say currently it's 51 of 100 of the key shares have to agree and sign that redemption transaction. So you burn your tBTC. If 51 of 100 of those nodes agree, they'll send you your Bitcoin back. And obviously, like, this is like the happy case where like everyone, you burn your tBTC or WBTC correctly, they send you it back. But like why decentralization matters is in like the unhappy case where there's a hack, some of these entities or signing keys get compromised, for example, or some of the signers are just malicious. On the centralized model, you just need like one person, one entity to be malicious or to do something wrong or to leak the keys, and the Bitcoin's gone. On the decentralized side, you have much more sort of robustness built in because as long as 51 of 100 of the signers are secure, honest, acting correctly, the Bitcoin is safe and secure.
Yeah. So it's not like a multi-sig where you see this every once in a while where, 2 or 3 of the people on a multi-sig get compromised and all of a sudden.
Yeah, I mean, like, one way to think of it, it's threshold signature, so it's not exactly the same as a multisig. Effectively, it's like a giant multisig. But yeah, you don't have 2 or 3 signers. It's currently it's an honest majority, so 51 of 100. With Schnorr signatures, which is a different type of threshold signature signing algorithm, we'll be able to upgrade that to potentially up to 501 out of 1,000. So each wallet will have 1,000 signers, and you can, as long as 501 of them agree, they can do the burn or redemption transactions correctly.
Now, this is awesome to me because I am a boomer Bitcoin holder, and I used to use, what was it, a Ren BTC was the one that kind of used to dominate DeFi, and now I think the Ren project still exists. I don't know, but clearly tBTC is kind of the new dominant model for like a decentralized version of Bitcoin, and I know the way I want to use it, of course, is a little plug to Quenta, and what we're doing is. I want to use it as margin to trade on Quenta, which is my particular use case. But like, what other use cases are either people using tBTC for right now, or what kind of use cases are you expecting in DeFi?
Yeah, I mean, so the one you mentioned is an obvious one, like margin for perps, and another is collateral to lend and borrow. So it's on Aave, Compound, several other lending platforms. You see just like LPing, so is another big one. So either stablecoin LPing with like WBTC or CBTC, or LPing with a volatile pair, tBTC and like a stable. We're also seeing more recently a lot of interest around restaking. So obviously, like with the success of
Oh,
Eigenlayer and Symbiotic, and their entire ecosystem, a lot of people are looking to deploy their Bitcoin assets, one to earn a yield and also to help secure new networks. So that's, I think, an interesting growth area as well. And then the second big growth area is this sort of Bitcoin renaissance. So the last year or so, there's been this emergence of a lot of new Bitcoin L2s, and all these Bitcoin L2s, need some kind of bridge to get Bitcoin to their network. And tBTC has been a great solution for a lot of them because they can just plug into tBTC, which is a bridge that's been running for a couple of years, and instantly, have Bitcoin on their network as opposed to having to try to re-implement their own bridge. And so they can compete. They can basically launch now. So we've seen some interesting projects like Mezzo and Bob that are taking that approach.
no, that's really interesting. I didn't, of course, I'm kind of like an ETH nerd, and I spend a lot of time there, so I hadn't even really considered how much tBTC is being used like outside the ETH network. Like, where is tBTC mostly being used right now, and how
Yeah.
many places have you guys managed to get this going?
Yeah, so certainly the biggest market for tBTC right now is definitely ETH L1. So that's where the largest lending pools are. I think probably the biggest one is on Aave, which Aave added support for tBTC as collateral probably about a month or so ago. So we've seen very strong growth there. Um, the
Oh, that's
biggest,
pretty recent,
yeah,
actually.
very recent. And then obviously like a lot of like I think the curve like stable pair with WPTC is quite large, similar for Uniswap. And then I don't know, like after that, I'm not sure what like the second biggest like chain for tBTC is, but we're currently on most of like the big EVM L2s. So Optimism, Arbitrum, Polygon. I think we're going to be accelerating our cross chain strategy here in the next couple months. So like where tBTC is should expand pretty quickly going forward. It's also on Solana, and I believe a couple of Polygon as well. I think that's where we have canonical deployments of tBTC, and hopefully we'll be able to start growing and bringing tBTC to more ecosystems a lot more
Okay,
quickly.
so
We've
all
nailed
of
that approach there.
all of those that you just named, those are all native and not just like bridged from L1 or something like that?
So currently the way that it works is you have to bridge first to Ethereum, and then you go from Ethereum to your L2 or Solana or wherever you want to go. Uh, Actually, we did recently add the ability to directly mint to Arbitrum,
Yeah, I
and then
saw that. That's actually why I asked.
I think the OP stack is next. So presumably Base and Optimism, you'll be able to direct mint there pretty soon. And obviously, like a lot of ecosystems are interested in this direct minting aspect, so they don't have to stop over on Ethereum first. And so we're working very hard to try to come up with like some reasonably repeatable and obviously very secure pattern to be able to deliver direct minting to as many ecosystems as possible.
Now, why did you guys start with Arbitrum? Is this really just because when you start with Ethereum, right, it's easy to kind of deploy that code on Arbitrum, or is there some other reason you guys decided to start there?
I think we were seeing just very strong growth on Arbitrum as one of the. I think that might have been, or probably still is, the second largest place for tBTC TVL. So I think it's just a prioritization of like where are the tBTC users, where's the most demand, where do we think like the uptake will be the quickest for a direct bridge. So I think that was the primary consideration.
Yeah, we got to get people aping that on Solana so they can buy all the meme coins with it, right?
Yeah, I mean,
You need
so there's definitely a lot of demand on Solana. But yeah, I think to your point, like the challenge with non-EVM chains is like it's just harder because we're
yeah.
we write a lot all the EVM code, a lot of that's reusable, whereas for the non-EVM chains, it requires they have different patterns, they have different ways of doing things that we just have to sort of write from scratch.
So what I noticed too, I noticed from your blog that you guys also have TUSD. Is that right?
Well, THUSD. Yeah.
THUSD. Okay. And so, how is that different than tBTC? Is it kind of the same concept here? And what's that collateralized by?
Yes, so USD is basically, if you're familiar with like liquidity or LUSD, it's very similar to that, except it uses tBTC as collateral. So you basically, like in the early days of tBTC, before we had a lot of integrations, we needed something for people to do with it. And so an obvious thing to do is to be able to borrow stables against your Bitcoin. So we wanted an easy way. The DAO wanted an easy way for people to borrow stables against their Bitcoin. So you can mint tBTC and then you can borrow THUSD against that Bitcoin. Either to basically to, if you want to lever up on Bitcoin, you can do that, or you can just basically
There
you
you
can
go. Of course I do.
whatever people do with stables, pay daily expenses, buy a house, whatever. And so THUSD is basically a CDP style stable coin that basically only uses what we view as like the most pristine collateral, which is Bitcoin, and in our view, like tBTC obviously is the most robust IOU token for Bitcoin.
Now, how new is this? Because I actually just learned about it today. So you're teaching me right now.
Yeah, so it's very new. I think I don't remember exactly when it launched. It was this year, so it's been around for probably a few months, maybe 6 months or something. What we're interested in right now with THUSD is potentially deploying it on these Bitcoin L2s that I mentioned before. So I believe that the DAO has deployed THUSD on Bob, for example. I assume it'll deploy it on Mezzo when Mezzo launches. And I think like this is certainly very interesting because all these Bitcoin L2s presumably want like a Bitcoin native stable coin. So I think it fits very well with this narrative of Bitcoin L2s and using your Bitcoin to borrow. So we're exploring like deploying THUSD in particular. Obviously, want to continue to grow it on ETH1, but in particular, we're interested in if it can sort of piggyback on this growth of Bitcoin L2s.
Interesting. That's something I hadn't thought of either. The need for kind of a stable coin on these Bitcoin L2s. Also, I was kind of wondering, have you guys talked with any other perps protocols specifically about using tBTC as margin, or is kind of the Quanta Synthetics partnership the first time you're venturing into this?
So on Arbitrum, I believe it's on GMX.
Okay.
That was earlier this year. I don't remember exactly when it launched on GMX.
I must have missed it. I used GMX like 2 days ago to ARBA funding rate, and I just somehow missed that in the drop down. I
Yeah,
guess I better pay closer attention.
yeah. So it is on GMX. I don't know off the top of my head what like the TBL there is, but yeah, certainly like I think very excited about Quenta and Synthetics, and hoping to see strong growth there as well.
Now, is there is there anything else? I want to give you a little chance to shill whatever you want to shill that that Threshold is working on right now, because I know we focused a lot on kind of the on how tBTC works, which is very interesting to me because I'm going to be using that, right? But what else do you guys have planned right now?
Yeah, I mean, so I think over the next, the focus right now is on TBL growth. So I think we're seeing like this interesting opportunity for Threshold and tBTC with all the recent changes at WBTC and BitGo and BitGlobal. I think people are looking for an alternative that's more decentralized. They sort of finally now they realize why decentralized custody is important. Um, and so I think there's a strong interest in sort of potentially migrating to tBTC. So you have a clear like view of like how the custody works long term, and you know that it can't get changed out from under you. With basically as a user, you have basically no say in what the custodians for centralized Bitcoin IOU do with that Bitcoin. It's much harder to change things in a decentralized network. So we're focused very much on growing TVL aggressively in the next couple of months, capturing as much market share as we can, because I think that's sort of a unique opportunity sort of to one-off grow tBTC and get as many integrations as possible.
Yeah,
The
there's
other
certainly
piece,
a lot of Bitcoin out there, right?
Yeah, and of course, like long term, obviously, we want to grow the pie as well. Like right now, there's the amount of Bitcoin that's ever been bridged to Ethereum or any other chain is very small. If we can grow that from like whatever it is now, like 1% probably, to 10, 15, 20% of all the Bitcoin that exists, like obviously that's going to grow the pie tremendously from where it is now, beyond us just capturing more market share. So basically, both those are of course big priorities. For the latter, then the other pieces, we want to just continually make tBTC more robust, censorship resistant, and secure. So right now, the deposit addresses are 51 of 100. So there's 100 signers, 51 of them basically agree they can move the Bitcoin. We're working on upgrading the underlying signature scheme from Threshold ECDSA to Schnorr, which will allow us to really significantly expand those signer sets, so we can move them up to as much as 501 out of 1,000. So just making it much more robust, much more decentralized. And then ultimately, I think this sort of what I think is probably the end game for tBTC is there's a lot of interesting work being done in the Bitcoin space in general, but specifically this idea of BitVM, which can enable, and BitVM2, which could potentially enable us to get rid of the honest majority assumption entirely and make it one of n. So in that case, as long as you have one honest rational actor out of all the nodes in the network, that Bitcoin is secure. And obviously, like that's an extremely good security model and trust model. It's not going to get really any better than that. So I think that's ultimately likely where we'll want to go, and that will help obviously with like bringing over Bitcoin holders that have never and would never trust like a centralized bridge or even the current instantiation of tBTC. They would have the conviction that, okay, this is something that we can use with confidence, like meets our like Bitcoin maxi like trust requirements in order to either earn yield on their Bitcoin or to basically utilize it to borrow and do other things in DeFi.
So are you in Sailor's DMs? Are we getting his Bitcoin on ETH?
I mean, that'd be great. I think we have there's. I think if Sailor started moving across, he'd probably hit the cap on Aave pretty quickly, which would make them happy, and we can keep bumping the cap up.
Very nice. Yeah, let's everybody who watched this, please at Sailor. We need to get his Bitcoin on ETH. Yeah, that's pretty exciting. It's really interesting to see these sort of unlocks happening with all that liquidity in Bitcoin, and of course, like obviously the ETH ETF disappointed people a little more than I think the Bitcoin ETF did. Right, the Bitcoin ETF actually led to a lot of inflows, a lot of excitement, and so trying to get all of that liquidity into DeFi to be able to use that for something a little more a little more dynamic is really interesting to me. And like you pointed out, the power of derivatives here to like take that Bitcoin and then create a stable coin on top of it that you can then use in Bitcoin DeFi. Like I think that's pretty exciting for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think look, to some extent, like I think this is more of like a Twitter phenomena where like there's this extreme like adversarial relationship between the Ethereum community and the Bitcoin community. I don't know if that's like fully representative of like the broader non-Twitter reality. But like ultimately, like I think these are extremely complementary ecosystems that are gonna fuel each other's growth for a long time. Like as an asset, you know, I like Bitcoin a lot. As an ecosystem, I like Ethereum a lot, and I think they work very well together. We can have a really amazing DeFi ecosystem that's been built on Ethereum and other chains, both L2s, EVM L2s, and non EVM chains the last 5 years or so. And I really think like that ecosystem is going to be supercharged when we can just sort of bring in a significantly larger amount of Bitcoin than we have historically.
Now, when are you guys going to give me TXMR? When are you bringing my Monero on chain?
Yeah, I mean, like in principle, like coins that are similar to Bitcoin can use a very similar model to tBTC, like TXMR, TZAC, T Doge. The issue is like if there's demand for that, like great, like it's just like it's very like these bridges are very expensive. Like a Bitcoin bridge is very expensive to run. And like as we've seen with BitGo, like the motivation for them to do what they did with WBTC is like they just were not making money on WBTC. So basically, the way that most Bitcoin bridges charge is like you charge a fee when someone goes back and forth across the bridge, and the usage pattern for most wrapped Bitcoins is you go across the bridge once, and then you like borrow against that Bitcoin, and it kind of just stays there. So there's not like a huge velocity generally back and forth across the bridge, which is actually kind of interesting about tBTC is like, I think I looked a couple weeks ago at like the volume, like the bridge velocity for tBTC versus WBTC. The bridge velocity over like the last 12 months for WBTC had been like, I think like 29,000 Bitcoin. And for tBTC, it had been almost 20,000. So like almost the same. Like WBTC is a little bit ahead, but like on significantly higher TVL, like orders of magnitude higher TVL. So I think like, and the reason why that is because tBTC is permissionless. Like you can just go to the dashboard, go to smart contracts, you can mint tBTC with your Bitcoin, you can redeem Bitcoin back from your tBTC. You don't have to do, KYC, you don't have to jump through a bunch of hoops to do it. It's just all on chain. Whereas with WBTC, you have to go create an account with what they call a merchant. That merchant will KYC you. They probably will reject you if you're, you and me, just retail users. And so like the volume, the bridge velocity is much smaller. So like theoretically, the business model for tBTC is significantly better because the bridge velocity is a lot higher. But when we think about adding other assets, it's like, given like how complicated these things are to run,
what's the bridge velocity on Monero going to be?
How much demand can we bring in? I mean, I think it'd be super cool to have like TXMR.
Now, could you do something like a rebasing or something to add a funding rate in? I know that's kind of because that was a problem that I know Synthetics had with the spot synths, because originally that was what Synthetics had as proof of concept, right? You could exchange SUSD for SETH. And the problem with this is a lot of people just used it to get SETH exposure. You pay the one-time fee, and then your counterparty is sitting on that exposure for free for the rest of all time, right? Now, one way, of course, derivatives solve this is by adding a funding rate, so you actually pay for exposure. Is there a world in which maybe these more niche assets can be brought from their native L1 onto ETH using some kind of fee for exposure?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's possible. Like we certainly like, I don't think there's ever going to be a world where tBTC would try to charge like a custody fee on the Bitcoin. Like I think that's like not, we're not, and then we're definitely, there's not even a way specifically because we designed it this way for like anyone to rehypothecate the underlying Bitcoin or do anything weird with it. But like if we were to add a new asset, like the model could potentially look a little bit different. Particularly because there's not really any alternatives for a lot of these other chains, other assets to bring them into Ethereum, into DeFi. So yeah, I think that's something that's interesting. It's an interesting idea worth exploring. There is a big token economics rework for T that's underway. I won't like front run the work that those people are doing, but there are a lot of interesting ideas around sort of making the bridge, the value capture for the bridge, a lot stronger and more robust for T token holders that doesn't rely necessarily on bridge velocity. So there's hopefully, that work will be ready to share pretty soon. But I think there are some interesting things that can potentially be done there.
Well, this has been a very interesting chat. I've learned a lot. And I know this is probably going to be released, I think, a week after we're talking right now. So I'm going to ask you about your market predictions, but we're actually going to know by the time anybody watching this will know what happened. So right now, are you bullish or bearish? And what positions do you have?
Oh, on a week-long time frame?
On a week-long time frame, let's go. I trade 5-minute charts, so
I'm not much of a trader. I mean, on a long time horizon, I'm very bullish on Bitcoin. I'm very bullish on Ethereum. I'm very bullish on Threshold and tBTC. So those are like my main positions I have, my stack that I'm like presumably never going to sell, particularly now that we can borrow against it on Aave and other places.
Oh, there you go. All you have to do is get liquidated.
Yeah. Well, hopefully that doesn't happen either.
Hopefully not. Hopefully not.
Hopefully Bitcoin is up only. But yeah, I mean, I think the in general, like the assets that I'm most interested in are ones that are just like, I think probably harkening back to like basically from like the original like Bitcoin roots, or how I got into crypto, is censorship resistance, basically decentralization, permissionlessness, and liveness. So can I access my funds whenever I want them? Can I move them regardless of what somebody else does or does not want me to do? I think that was what interested me in crypto to begin with, and I think that's still why I'm here today.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I think it seems like there's been so much focus lately, kind of especially from Quenta and from a lot of different projects on improving the user experience. You see these projects like Hyperliquid that are really, I got to hand it to Hyperliquid. They have great UX, but a lot of these projects are sacrificing decentralization, and it kind of makes me wonder, what are we doing this all for, right? If you wanted to go trade on Robinhood, you can have a great experience on Robinhood if you want to trust Robinhood.
Mhm.
And many people do. I keep my retirement portfolio on Robinhood, and it's incredible. But the purpose of what we're doing here with DeFi is to have something that you can custody yourself that's permissionless. And I feel like in the last few years, I've seen that main value proposition in the narrative kind of get lost. Right. So it's great to talk to you and like hear that there are still people out there who really see that as something that's at the core of what we're working toward out here, and not just, flipping meme coins or something like that, which is all good and fun. But
Yep.
at the end of the day, I want to be able to be my own bank. That's what I showed up to do, right?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think like there's a lot of great products that like you said that people are building that are improvements on UX UI that are fun. Like that's great. I mean, I think it's great that people are trying to do that and innovating on that dimension. I just, for me personally, what I got interested in the space was the censorship resistance and permissionless aspect of it. And I think like if you fast forward 5, 10, 20 years, like those are the assets that are still going to matter the most. Um, but like in the
Agreed.
meantime, if
Agreed.
people want to improve upon, obviously like we need a lot of UX improvements. So like please, all builders keep cracking that way. Um, we need like improvements to the traditional financial system on other aspects too. So if there are other ways to do that, I'm all for it.
It's been a fun time talking to you. Um, I really appreciate you showing up and explaining all this. I just want to ask where people can learn more about Threshold, and if you have any social media or anything that you want to plug, and maybe something that you want people to do to interact with Threshold if they're curious, right? What's the first action people should go take to interact with Threshold?
Sure. I mean, so we would obviously love to have Quanta users use tBTC as collateral
All
or as
right.
margin, of
Good
course.
CTA. Great CTA.
So there's a lot of ways to get tBTC. Obviously you could buy it. You can just acquire it directly on an AMM. You can mint Bitcoin, mint tBTC with Bitcoin. So if you go to dashboard.threshold.network, that's the minting dashboard, and you can just go through the flow there. If you have Bitcoin, and then you can bring it to Ethereum. You can bring it to other EVM-L2s, other chains, and deploy it wherever you'd like. If you'd like to just get involved with the community, we have a Discord, Twitter account, or X account is I think at the T Network. I'm on Twitter as well, but not super active personally, but just at MacLane Wilkison. But yeah, thank you for having me, Burt.
All right. Thank you very much for talking to us. And yeah, we'll look forward to seeing what Threshold has in store for us. And I look forward to that Threshold XMR.
Awesome.
All right.
Thank
Talk to
you.
you later.